I grew up in the suburbs of Maryland. So we were only about 15 minutes away from Washington, D.C. And it was in a really nice community. A lot of my friends' parents worked in some form of government, whether that was the Labor Relations Board, or there were a handful of people who worked in Congress or in the news. Sort of like the typical business happened to be government. Not everybody worked in there, but a lot of people did. I have a younger brother who's 3 years younger than me, and we were close. I grew up like really enjoying television. I I was one of those kids who I would look at the newspaper on Wednesdays because I could go to the style section, which was sort of the entertainment section of the newspaper. And the reason I would go there is because that's when they would list the ratings for the most watched television programs of the week. And I was always really curious about what was popular, what were people watching, and was that the same things that I enjoyed? And I never really thought about it going forward as like, this could be a job one day. But when I look back at sort of how I grew up and what I just enjoyed, it was like, it was looking at things like the television ratings. And I used to wake up in the mornings on Sundays very early, not for any reason other than there was a program called America's Top 40, which played the 40 biggest hits on the radio. And I think it was an international show. And I used to write down in a little notebook the biggest songs of the week until I realized one day when I went to a bookstore, there's already a magazine called Billboard that does that. So you don't have to spend 4 hours of your morning writing down all these songs. I think I still have it in a notebook somewhere in like a bin of my old memorabilia. I grew up able to walk to school, which was kind of a cool luxury. And so there's a little bit of that freedom that you get from hanging out with friends in the neighborhood and being able to go back and forth. And sometimes just like sitting down and hanging out at the tree stump for 30 minutes after school and catching up that way. And I always did also like being part of shows and productions at the school, whether that was like school choirs or once a year they did a musical, and I would participate in those. And a lot of my friend base came from that too. I never thought of performing as something that was a passion, but it was just an enjoyable experience and a way to hang out with sort of like-minded friends.
Didn't you also enjoy Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? And you watched that moment when he went to visit the Hulk and he was putting on his makeup.
Yeah, I don't know why that always stuck with me, but I found it fascinating. I'm sure there's like millions of views on it. I can't be the only person who was just astonished when they showed you on a kid's program what TV was like. Yeah, that always stuck with me. I always just thought that was an amazing thing to peek behind the scenes and see what it's like to have someone transform into the Incredible Hulk on what arguably was probably a pretty silly television show. But at the time, growing up, I thought it was everything. It was so cool.
When you were young as well, your mother passed away and then your father remarried. And I wonder how that impacted you, because I believe your stepmom, she had quite a lot of infighting in her part of the family. You had to once duck under a car.
That's true. So my mom died when I was 5. She had cancer. And so she passed away. I have a handful of memories of her and certainly learned a lot about her from my dad and from my grandmother. My dad remarried a few years after that. I was still pretty young. But yeah, my stepmom came from the South. Mississippi is where she grew up. And it was sort of like when you think of classic soap operas or primetime soap operas from the 70s or 80s, even shows like Dallas, where there's always big fights and then all of a sudden people are best friends and someone else is fighting. Like, it was not anywhere near that bad, but there were hints of that were real, that were part of this family. So you never knew which aunt was fighting with my mom at the time until we would be down in Mississippi and accidentally in this relatively small town in the Biloxi area, you might accidentally have parked very close to where they were also having dinner. And for some reason, we weren't allowed. I don't even know if they realized that we were in town at that point. 2 years later, we're staying at their house. So these are things that you kind of just sort of fly past you and they just become part of your life. It doesn't seem any different than anything else. And I think if you learn any lessons from that, if I learned any lessons from that, it's there's no reason to hold a grudge for very long because family's with you forever.
I think one of the things that was also a part of you was going to summer camps. I think it's the one that your father also went to. Was it Camp
That's right.
Taconic?
It's still a really important part of my life. So on the East Coast, and again, I don't know if this is anything that you've talked about with anyone else or experienced, but summer camps are a pretty big deal on the East Coast. And a lot of kids from the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area that will spend 7 or 8 weeks often at a sleepaway camp. I grew up in Maryland, like I said, and like you said, it was not quite as common then, but my father had grown up in the New York area, and when he, I think, started probably at 7 or 8 years old, instead of spending the summer in the city, his parents sent them to the Berkshires, which is sort of the mountain area in Western Massachusetts. It's where James Taylor sings about the Berkshires a lot in songs. Beautiful place. And he spent quite formative years of his life there. Same with my uncle. They were there from probably the ages of 7 or 8 till they were late teens, early 20s. So they would go as kids and then they'd essentially graduate to being counselors. And so when I got to be a little bit older, when both my brother and I could go at the same time, my dad thought it would be something beneficial for us to do. I started going when I was 12 years old, and I spent 10 summers there as a camper and a counselor. But I didn't know anybody at all there when I went, which is fairly unique because quite a few kids start earlier than me. They'll start when they're 7 or 8 years old or nine years old. And so they'll know these kids from that age. And a lot of times they'll go to camp with those kids for a very long time. I had to make friends out of whole cloth, basically. I never even heard of the cities that they were growing up in. And we'd find commonality. And a lot of times that just happened from living in a bunk with 9 or 10 other people in these cots, basically, where you had very little separation from them. So everyone knew what everyone else was doing a lot. But the thing that's kind of cool about the summer is you have a real opportunity to reinvent yourself. No one knows what you were like at school. So if you wanted to explore things that you never thought possible, like camp was a really good place to do that. And this was one of those camps that it wasn't particularly amazing at any one thing. So it wasn't an all sports camp or an all theater camp or all tennis camp. They had all of those activities. They still have a lake. And so you could do pretty much anything that you were interested in or figure out what you really liked and do it there. So I got a lot out of being at camp. And I actually, now my older daughter also goes to that camp. They were closed last year because of the pandemic. So it'll have been 2 years, which in camp terms is a lifetime. So everyone's very excited for the end of this month in June, they'll be able to go back. And also because so many kids now from 12 and up are able to get vaccinated, I think it's opening up a lot of other opportunities to have a summer experience, I think that's very similar to what they would have remembered from the pre-pandemic times. And I actually still spend quite a lot of time back at Taconic. I don't know if this is something maybe you'd seen as well in my background, but the thing that I got the most out of when I was at camp, when I was around 14 or 15, we got to do sort of special secret projects at camp where your entire age group, so all of the 14-year-olds, they get to put on a banquet. They call it senior banquet for the entire camp, which consists of like this big meal that is a themed meal, followed by a big sketch with a giant centerpiece in the playhouse. And they present this to the entire camp and everybody dresses up like it's a formal event. And so, sometimes the theme might be like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory or Dr. Seuss or space or just something big and epic. And they tease what it might be, but it's not revealed until that night. So it's this massive project and it's an incredibly creative and exciting time for 14-year-olds and even their counselors. And that was one of the first times where I got to sort of present something that felt major, that you kind of like can put your stamp on something at a place that's meaningful for you, so that 5 or 10 years later, people might be like, oh, remember that senior banquet, the space one? That was a really special one. And the performance that happens there it's mostly sketch comedy based. So there's maybe 50 or 60 kids per group. Impossible to put that many kids into one show. So they split them up into whoever wants to be on stage and they get to do some fun performance and they write it themselves. And sometimes they make a song parodies, real camp stuff. And so that was sort of one of the first times that I got to experience something that was real comedic. And I always found that was the age, 14, 15, that you start to really get your sense of what you find funny and what comedy is. So that was for me, junior high grade. So 7th, 8th grade, that 12, 13, 14 was when I started to obsessively watch Saturday Night Live, when I started to like stay up late during Friday nights or on vacations to watch the late night shows. There was a show called In Living Color. It was a really, really big deal. It was a sketch comedy show that Mondays after it aired, I would spend my entire lunch period going over every sketch with friends. So that was imbued in me as to like, that's what's funny and let's try and do things like that. But I didn't know how to do it. I just knew what I liked. When I go back to summer camp now, I help the oldest kids who are 15. So they're going into their second year of high school, sophomore year of high school. And I help them create a complete sketch comedy show no themes, no secrets, just real hard comedy sketches. And to me, it's like the show that I always wanted to do when I was that age. But now that I have sort of the experience of work and having worked in comedy, I get to bring a little bit of life experience to that. And sometimes it's the first opportunity for these kids to really get a sense of what they find funny, or if they like working in comedy, or even what type of comedy part of comedy they enjoy or entertaining. Some people really like writing better. Sometimes they enjoy shooting little short films. I'm sure they do all the time, and on TikTok and on Instagram and wherever else. Like, it's very easy to do that now. But the amount of thought and time that it takes to put it together, and also the speed of which something can come together before they then get to present it to all of their friends and peers, and the people they really want to impress are the 18 to 25-year-old counselors, who, if they can make them laugh, then it makes them really feel like, they've stepped it up adult wise. And it's a great experience. And, my kid's like 2 years away from doing it, which will be really wild. We'll see if she listens to me, if I ever do, we get to work together.
So when you were at the camp for so many years, were you in different positions for that sketch to figure out whether you liked acting, you liked writing, you liked producing? Was that how you figure out what you really enjoy?
I think it certainly had a little bit to do with it. It was like, I think the seedlings were there. There were a couple of things, like the camp had a camp newspaper that they put out once a week. And I worked on that when I was a camper, and when I was a counselor and I oversaw kids, my activity was the Tatler, which is the camp newspaper. I think that really did help to form like things that I liked, that I kind of knew I liked. I like structure. I like having deadlines and goals. I liked the idea of creating something sort of a little fun and unique and helping kids. I would say I think a lot of it came in my later teen years, and as I started to get into college, that age, where I knew I liked helping others achieve their goals. And like, one of those things that I always thought was, in the summertime especially, if you can get kids to write, not force them to write, but get them to want to write, like, that is, it doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter what it looks like or sounds like. Like, if they're coming to an activity and they're going to spend an hour writing about the talent show or coming up with some improvised piece of nonsense, I'll print it for you. You can show your parents what you've done outside of that. It's really something beyond just, hanging out and sneaking candy in the bunk with your friends.
So how did you end up deciding you would major in broadcast journalism at Syracuse University?
I think as I went into high school and as I was looking at university, I was hoping to do something in television. And the thing that I thought was the most feasible was to go to a communications school, because I had a sort of general sense of what I liked and what I thought was possible. Broadcast journalism was one of those things. I enjoyed watching sports. I liked the idea that you could work in sports. I know that Syracuse has a lot of alumni who graduated to go on to places like ESPN or any of the major broadcast networks. I knew you could learn a lot there. The longer I was there, the more I gravitated towards television, radio, and film, more so than I did broadcast journalism. So I actually had switched my major into television, radio, and film. Part of that was some of the classes that I took on the television end that were different than the broadcast end. So we spent a lot of time in those early days in those first classes learning more about how to do a 90-second story for local news. And I thought that was a little bit constricting in my brain. It's really hard to tell a story in that short a period of time, especially when you have all sorts of ideas. And on that end, you have to tell the truth. At least that's the hope in news. So when I got to do some of the other television classes, you got to just completely come up with pitches for news shows. I really enjoyed working for the college radio station at Syracuse. It was called Z89, still is called Z89. And they mirrored what a pop radio was like. A lot of typical college radio stations are, anyone can have 2 hours. They can play anything they want. They can talk anytime they want. Z89 was, this is what an hour is like. We're going to produce it like they do at Z100 in New York City. And so, we're going to play 10 songs. You're going to talk every 3 songs. You're going to play ads here. You're going to play PSAs here. And you can only talk up to, 20 seconds, because that's when the song starts. So when you start, you have to do the overnights, which are the 2 a.m. slots or the 4 a.m. slots, which are death. They're so hard, even for an 18-year-old who, you think can stay up all night and do anything. Like, when you still have to go to classes the next day, that is a challenge. But that type of broadcasting, I really enjoyed. The more I was there, the more I worked on stuff like the morning shows, which is one of the key time periods for radio. Some of my friends still work in radio. They ended up professionally going to be DJs or programmers, and a lot of them came from Z89. And that really helped to inform what I enjoyed, which was for that era. The show South Park, it was a massive, massive hit in 1998. And I think it must have been every Thursday because the show's been on Wednesdays I think since then. So the next day, we would talk about what happened on South Park, do trivia about it. People would call into the station, or college station, but people still called into it, usually junior high kids probably. So whatever was happening in the news, a lot of it was Y2K related. So we did a lot of like Y2K jokes. It didn't matter what it was. Whatever was going on, we were trying to figure out, all right, can we make 4 hours out of this? What else are we going to talk about? What else are we going to do? And that's what I liked about late night also. Like the idea that, oh, people do this. People do this for a living. And the things that you've always liked from your days of looking at the style section and listening to America's Top 40, people do that for a living all the time in all these different platforms. So that really took me into a space where I thought, I know I want to move to LA. I'm going to give television a go. And hopefully I can find something that fits the thing that I like. But I mean, ultimately, eventually it worked out that way. But I didn't have a great plan for how to do it. I had a car and I drove the 3,000 miles from the East Coast to the West Coast and stayed with my one family member who lived out here, who was not a particularly close family member, but became a really good. I mean, they were the reason I was able to live out here with no job at first. But I credit Z89 a lot for helping to sort of shape the things that I liked the most about broadcast.
So you drove that 3,000 miles without a job. How do you end up being an NBC page?
So that kind of goes back to camp a little bit. The people who ran the camp knew that I wanted to work in television. They were very kind. We were close from all the years that I'd been there. And they introduced me to another person who had been the newspaper counselor at camp and also had gone to Syracuse probably 10 years before I had. And they introduced me to him on email. His name's Rob. And Rob worked at NBC as an executive, I think a development executive. And Rob helped me to get my resume to the page program. So when I had officially moved out there, I was able to get an interview. And, you know, you sit down and like, I have very little on my resume. It's the school I went to. And then I did this cross-country trip for a really long time because of my love of camp, another summer at camp, even after I graduated. So I traveled for almost 9 months around the country, around the US, before I officially moved out to LA. I had that on my resume. I don't know if anyone looks at that as something like, wow, but I thought it was at least a talking point. And then I could say, wherever you lived, if you lived in the US or grew up in the US, chances are I've been pretty close to your hometown. And so I had what I thought was a pretty good meeting with the people at the page program who ran it. And they said, you know, check back in about 8 weeks and see what you have. We'll see if we have an opening. Because the way the page program works is they don't actually know how many people they need to hire, certainly at least at the time. It's based in part on, it's a year-long program. So if you've reached your year, you have to leave. But also jobs open up often at NBC. And a lot of times for those entry-level positions, they like hiring pages. And so you never know how many people will end up getting jobs at a certain point. And so the number of losses equals the number of openings. So that's why they often say like, yeah, we don't know. So check back in a couple of weeks and we'll see, we'll see where you are. And I was like, okay, great. Well, I guess I got to find a PA position somewhere and try and, run and grab coffee for somebody on a set if I can, not knowing anybody in town. So I'm driving back to my cousin's place and there's a call on they had a landline only at the time. I'm a little old. They had a landline at the time and they had an answering machine. And so on the answering machine was a message from the page program. And they said, we'd actually like you to start next week. And so it was just a great relief. It was exciting for me. It was a great piece of luck that they wanted to squeeze me into the next new page class, and they could. And so I started, it was October of 1999, and that really did set me on the career that I'm at.
So was the page program structured in the sense that they will make sure you were exposed to many different parts of NBC? Were they just slotting you in wherever they needed your help?
It was a little bit of both. The more you told them, the people who ran it, the more you sort of gave a sense of what you were hoping to accomplish, the more they gave you opportunities to at least meet people in that field. So at the time, so this is in LA, like I said, Burbank is where NBC was located. That was the campus at the time. The things that they made all the pages do, you had to give tours of the lot. You worked whatever shows were on the lot at the time that had audiences. So It was always the Tonight Show with Jay Leno. It was often game shows, just depending on the era that you were at, would depend on the game show. And then you could apply for assignments after a certain point. So if you'd been at the page program for a couple of months and sort of put in your time, then you could apply to work as a page in maybe the development office for comedy or the primetime programming department, or there was publicity, there was people who did ad sales, who made the promos, and then there was also a physical production group also. So there were always different assignments that you could do. Sometimes you did really well in your assignment and you got a chance to, and there was an opening somewhere in that world and they liked taking the page because the pages, they'd put some time into that person. They knew the lay of the land a little bit and they could hire them and bring them along. That didn't happen for everybody, but there were so many pages who got jobs working on shows also that someone a couple of years removed from us might be like, hey, we're going to hire 3 PAs. We want to see, are there any pages who are interested in doing that? And so everybody would put their resumes over there and hope that they get into those jobs. So it could be a little bit competitive sometimes, but the era that I was in, there were people who had like a real varied desires of what they wanted to do in the industry. So there were some that wanted to be writers. There were some that wanted to work in journalism or entertainment journalism. And so there was a path to places like Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood, or even the local news here, which was KNBC, like was the major Los Angeles affiliate that we were associated with. Or sometimes the positions would open up at the Tonight Show and people could get onto that show. My first job out of the page program was, again, sort of a bit of luck. I really enjoyed getting to meet and talk to people. So I was curious about what happened on the soap operas in the daytime world and sort of saw how they worked. And same thing with like the Tonight Show writer's room. I mean, dozens and dozens of places I was able to sort of just have informational conversations and meetings with people, which was also like a great opportunity, which it's almost like a graduate program, the page program, for people who are particularly interested in the field. Sometimes if an assistant took a week off, instead of hiring a temp, executives would ask pages to work that desk for a week or two. So that gave you also exposure to working and seeing what it's like to work on a desk. So that happened to me once in the late night department where I'd never like worked a desk before. So I was incredibly nervous answering the phone, not wanting to make a mistake. The person who was in charge of late night at NBC was a man named Rick Ludwin, and he passed away a few years ago, sadly. But he was just an encyclopedia of late night and television knowledge, and I just didn't want to disappoint him. So I said very little during that 1 week that I was there. And he must have found that charming because he was always very nice to me in the hallways after that week and always remembered my name. I don't know. He saw something. A few months after that, I did have an assignment. I was working in a different area at NBC, but I had to call Rick's office. There was a Conan question that I didn't know the answer to, but I knew that Rick and his assistant, Lisa, one of them would know. So I call and Lisa's like, again, got to realize this is 2000. Nobody had cell phones that like no one texted then. So if you were out of sight, you were out of mind. And so I called her and Lisa's like, I'm so glad you called. I'm moving to Hawaii. And if you want this job, I think you could get it. And Rick liked it when you were here. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. In part because I was still deciding is a nice way to put it. Like, I still wasn't sure of whether or not it made sense to try to get a job in an office working in the executive wings, or to try to get a job on a show, which would be a more production driven job. I wasn't sure yet. I hadn't really had that much exposure to either one. In my head, even after almost having been at a page for a year, I was just sort of in search of the idea that could I have an impact on shows, how they get made, how they look, anything, what type of comedy might be on it. Is there a way that I can have an impact on the show? I loved late night so much. And even like working as a page on the Tonight Show, getting to see just what the day was like and how efficient it was and how much joy it brought to people, how much joy it brought to the audience that was there, what it was like when they'd have a massive guest on, which at the time was like the biggest was NSYNC. When NSYNC was on, the year 2000, people camped out for days just to get tickets to a free talk show where they would play one song. And these were real moments that they were creating. And I thought, like, let's try this. Let's see what it's like to work in the late night office. And then I ended up spending the next, I think, 11 years there.
I came across this wonderful memorial that you wrote for Rick, and he strikes me as such an incredible person. I think when you were just starting, he was already bringing you into big meetings, like with Howard West and George Shapiro, even though you didn't really know what you were doing at the time as well?
No, it was ridiculous. I was granted access to people and experiences that just were so beyond me for my age and the amount that I'd worked in TV. But the thing that Rick really valued was he was about 30 years older than me. And we'd watch, whether it was Jay Leno or Conan O'Brien or Saturday Night Live. Those were three of the bigger shows at the time where we would be reading sketches and watching either cuts or watching rehearsals, and then before they would tape them or air them live. And he always thought, if we both like something and we're both laughing out loud and we come from two very distinct eras, we're a generation removed from you, and if we both like it, then for broadcast television, like, this has a chance to be pretty good and get some attention. And so, that was happening on a weekly basis or daily basis because of the types of shows we did. He was always willing to answer questions about any era of TV, because he'd been working at NBC since 1981, I think, was when he started. He'd worked in TV since the 70s. He'd been a producer on shows before he became an executive. But during all those times, he had worked with anyone who had ever hosted The Tonight Show. And I think he's probably the only person who can say that. So he didn't work with Steve Allen on The Tonight Show, but he worked with Steve Allen on specials and Jack Parr on specials. And so, the people who created Laugh-In and like iconic shows from the 50s through the 2000s. And it was just a tremendous amount of exposure, and to people who, for me, for everybody, but exposure to people who helped essentially create the genre that we all just came to love. And I mean, it was such a unique experience. There's literally no one else that I know who's ever done exactly what Rick did.
Did you get a sense of what would make a good host just being around Rick, because he had worked with all the different hosts?
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot to glean from that, especially as we started to, and the longer I was there, I got to sort of experience it firsthand as well. These shows are both comedy shows and talk shows. And so the people who host them have to be really versatile in terms of how they approach a show. And that is both in terms of like the tone of the comedy that they do, their interests, having a wide amount of a variety of interests, and wanting to talk to people and being interested in people and being good listeners. There is something really interesting right now about working at a time where so many people have opportunities to showcase what they would do were they to host a show. Podcasts obviously are a big part of that. YouTube and TikTok have created opportunities to do short form comedy and long form comedy in ways that were never really possible even 20 years ago. And so you get a chance to see a lot of what someone might be like were they to get their own show, based on the types of things that they want to do and are interested in, and even what they decide to joke about on something like Twitter, and how they deal with current events. They can do it instantaneously now. So we were always looking at those things when we were talking about hosts in that 2000s era. And also when it came to the idea of exposure to more people at an earlier time period, which again, in today's modern era has a little less urgency to it probably than it did certainly in the early 90s and even in the mid 2000s. But being on at say 11:30 at night, when you are following the late local news, there was a different expectation as to what you were supposed to talk about and how you presented yourself than, say, the 12:30 show or later shows, which had at that time a more of a wild, maybe anarchic feeling sometimes, depending on who it was or what they were doing. And even same thing with something like Saturday Night Live. The later it gets in that hour or the 90 minutes, the stranger the sketches get. And that's done, on purpose. That's sort of the way that clock goes, has always been really interesting. So that was all sort of like imbued. And some of it you kind of know based on just being a fan and watching them. And a lot of it you learn or a lot of it I learned from Rick when we talked about what he thought made a good host.
That was very interesting for me, that you have described him as being a man of conviction, and he knew what made a good host, even though everyone else said otherwise.
Yeah, it's really easy to be dismissive of shows and hosts early on in life cycle when more people are watching with a very keen eye and the expectations are pretty massive. And you are up against what bosses think of the show and what stations might think of a show, what advertisers think about that show, what the audience thinks about the show. I think most importantly, certainly like again in those earlier years, which includes the 90s and even sometimes like into the 2000s, there might be a blog here or there that tells you something pretty instantaneously, but a lot of stock was put into things like focus groups or people who were tourists in Vegas who, if they wanted to get out of the sun, they would go into a little room and watch a show and then tell you their thoughts about a show. So it was a different type of focus group. And relying on those people solely is often not really getting a sense of looking at a sort of a longer period of time, because as a host, you grow into that role. You're not necessarily fully formed on day one. And even if you're a professional and you've had that experience, who you are day one is not who you are day 100, day 1000. That changes based on, that sort of 10,000 hours philosophy, where the longer you do it, the more people get comfortable with you as a host and the better you get as a host and a show. So people are quick to want to make changes in television. I think this has actually changed a little bit and people have gotten a little bit more patient over the years, but you can pull a show after 3 weeks, after 6 weeks in prime time. If it's not holding up, you are looking for potential in late night a lot. And so with Rick, he always stood behind Conan O'Brien, especially, which was such an out of the box idea at the time, because he'd never been on television, certainly in any hosting capacity. He had written for The Simpsons, he'd written for Saturday Night Live. He was on The Simpsons when he got the job to host late night. And on top of that, it's following David Letterman, who not only was iconic for how he handled television at 12:30 at night and just created a generation of followers, but also he was moving into this incredibly high level position at CBS at 11:30, which is like it was a real competition. And so the pressures that were felt from on high at the network, which again, I was in high school and college at the time, so I was just watching it from afar, but the pressures were enormous. And so the easiest thing to do in that situation is to say yes to whatever your boss wants. And depending on the boss, they were ready to, I think, pull the plug on some of these shows and, hit the reset button. And Rick he stood behind Conan, and he was the one who, he just didn't miss a day. He always worked. And so he knew everything. He just knew everything that happened on that show. He knew how it was growing. He could watch the growth. He could see the progression. It is his job. That's his responsibility. That was what he was hired to do. But it would be so easy to skip a Thursday, to go home early, to keep your eye on something else. And he never did that. And he always had smart notes and thoughts to give on shows. But also, I think he had a loyalty also, because he, getting a little choked up thinking about this, he just had a real belief. He had a real belief in what Conan and Jeff Ross and that group wanted to do and what they were trying to accomplish. That was different. And sometimes different takes a little while to come across on television and to be accepted. And I mean, not just television, but certainly there. And when it pays off, as it really did there, and in a lot of places, but Conan's, I think, the best example. They'll talk about him forever at the Conan show. They never forgot it, and they still don't. They're wrapping up their TBS show and at the end of this month, and then they're going to go on to do another show. I'm just a fan at this point. I don't work with them anymore. But they, I just, anytime one of these things happens, whether it's like an anniversary moment or, a lot of them came to celebrate Rick's life when we had a memorial, or even just something like now. I'll just give you one example. So do you watch Saturday Night Live, or are you familiar with Saturday Night Live at all?
Not so familiar.
So there's a comedian on the show. Her name is Melissa Via New York. And she's been on the show for probably 5 or 6 years. She does a lot of impressions. She was a guest on Conan. And on the show, she did an impression of this old show from the 50s, 60s called The Little Rascals. I'm not going to try to do it. I'm not a performer. But she did all these little voices of all the Little Rascals. And it was hilarious. The first person I thought of was Rick, because he would have found that absolutely hysterical. He loved old television. He loved classic TV. He loved that sort of like quirky thing where you could bring something from the 60s and it could still be relevant now, even if you didn't recognize the show. And it tickled Conan in the interview as well. And after I watched it, I sent an email to Jeff Ross, who's the executive producer at Conan and friend. And I just said, like, Rick would have loved that. Like, he just would have loved it. And he wrote back something very similar, like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, it was I thought of it too. And so it's just like, they're never too far away from our thoughts, I think. That's how much of an impact he had on all of us.